Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products. Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Jen Bentley, Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and today I'm here with my Extension Dairy Team colleagues, Fred Hall from Northwest Iowa, Dr. Gail Carpenter, State Extension Dairy Specialist, and Dr. Larry Tranel from Northeast and Southeast Dairy Field Specialist. So welcome back to the podcast, Dairy Team.
I'm excited to be here.
Well, we got a lot of professional development time together as an Extension Dairy Team last week, and we had the opportunity to participate in a 2-day professional development course called Crucial Conversations to learn and improve our skills that help us navigate through tough conversations. And so I guess on today's episode, we're going to discuss key concepts each of us learned from this course and how they can be implemented on our everyday lives, whether it be at home or at work. And, you know, as we went through this professional development course, we thought it could be applied very well to even farm families, those working with employees, and just working on the industry. A lot of good tips that can be shared as we have those crucial conversations. So as we start the podcast, Gail, Larry, or Fred, do you want to just share maybe your initial thoughts and experiences of working through that Crucial Conversations program?
Well, I cheated a little bit. I actually read the book before we went to the training, and part of the reason I wanted to do the training was actually because I read the book earlier this summer and just highlighted a whole bunch of stuff in there and got a lot out of it, and wanted to get extra practice in Crucial Conversations. So, and maybe I'm just a slower learner than everybody else on the team. I have to go through things twice apparently to learn them. I had to read the book and then take the training before I really got it. But I think I really enjoyed having the conversations, the practice conversations that we had kind of with the team, and practicing some of these skills. It's crucial conversations can be really hard, and part of what makes them crucial is that a lot of times we have opposing opinions. So people who think two different things about a topic, and it's maybe a high stakes issue, and maybe there's a lot of emotions. And I know for me and a lot of people in the Midwest, maybe not to stereotype us out here, but it's a lot easier just to kind of clam up and shut down and not have those hard conversations and just pretend like everything's okay. So I really enjoyed kind of practicing some of these skills about being upfront and honest with people, and adding to the shared pool of meaning, as we called it.
Yeah, I think I did a lot of things that Gail said. I was pretty impressed with the program, but I read the book about 5 years ago, but I really wasn't that impressed with the book the first time I read it through. Maybe I read it through too fast and didn't try to apply it much. But I think going through the class with our colleagues here, and also kind of doing the role play stuff and actually watching the videos do the role play, I think kind of opened up a few more conversation pieces with me, whether just kind of taking a little time to think and breathe a little bit, take a deep breath before we start saying something, but then the role play I thought was pretty impactful and actually a little dramatic for me as well, just as we were able to do that as a dairy team.
It was interesting for me that I actually started to think through a conversation before I opened my mouth. And some of the points that were presented in the role play, like Larry said, I think were really impactful.
That's because you're high deliberative, Fred. Not to pull in a bunch of strength stuff into it, but I can hear your deliberative coming through.
And I didn't read the book going into the class, so I'm actually starting the book right now. So I'm kind of flip-flop from Gail, you know, doing the role play and kind of interactive part first and then going back to the book. But I think either way could work. But really some good information as far as how we handle those conversations. And the one thing I wrote down here is, what options do we have when we're faced with a crucial conversation? We can avoid it, We can face it, or we can handle it face it and handle it poorly, or we can face it and handle it well. And I think, going through this class, it really teaches you can face it and handle it very well.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of it. We can all think of examples of a time when our emotions have gotten high, or we kind of get, tongue-tied in the moment, and don't handle things the best way, and handle things poorly. And I see Fred laughing. None of the people listening on this podcast can will be able to see Fred laughing, but it looks like maybe you thought about some examples too, Fred.
Yeah, some of the conversations where we really were opposing, not just with my colleagues here in the podcast, but yeah, I really think that as I look at what we've learned, man, I would have handled some of those conversations a lot differently.
Yeah, I think the more we sit at the kitchen table with farm families and you see some of the communication dynamics go through, there's just, I think, a lot of simple things that could kind of, when people would go through a class like this, where they kind of recognize, yeah, I guess I am kind of being a little emotionally charged with the way I just kind of responded back to you in such a kind of maybe a quicker, a little harsh manner or something like that. But a lot of times we don't notice that until we see it in other people or see it recognized or just brought out in somebody else's personality or whatever.
Did anyone else see that, some of the things we say are being interpreted differently than the way they came out of my mouth?
Yep.
Yeah, I actually put that down as one of my probably the biggest thing I learned from the program was that concept of how you try to make the conversation safe, and just how people, again, the emotionally charged situations, they start pointing fingers, blaming, or they can kind of perceive it the opposite way it was intended. And so I think part of that skill is just, well, I didn't mean to, or don't mean to say it this way, or I don't mean for you to feel this way, or I don't, but to kind of start that conversation with a negative about telling them what you don't want to make sure, or you want to make sure we're not saying, and then come back and actually tell them what you did want to say.
Well, and that's where the training kind of started, with this idea of getting unstuck before you even start a conversation. And the skill that they put with that was unbundling with CPR. There were a lot of acronyms in this, and if you have I'm glad I have the book, because I keep referring back to it to remember what all these acronyms mean. But CPR isn't CPR like we think about in first aid. It's content, pattern, or relationship. And the point that was made is that a lot of times when we get those knee-jerk reactions, or you're emotionally charged about a conversation, it's usually not about the actual content of what the person just said. It's usually not that that phrase or that comment that they made, or that thing that they did in isolation. It's usually because there's been a pattern or of behavior, and that's affected the relationship. So usually when we're getting started in some of these high stakes and high and strong emotions, a lot of times when we're in those positions, it's not because of the content, it's because of the pattern or how that's affected the relationship. So the example they used was a dandelion, so you see this dandelion sticking out of the ground, but a weed is going to have roots that go deeper into the ground that you can't see. So just the content, or just the weed that you see above ground, isn't usually what we're upset about. It's usually whatever's running deeper.
And a lot of that had to do with the stories that we're telling ourselves, whether it's the person we're talking to and they've created a story because we didn't address it completely, or what we're hearing and building the story because there wasn't enough information to be around it. I thought that made a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, as you mentioned, like building the story, then we also have that separating that fact from the fiction, separating the story from the facts. I thought that was pretty helpful as well.
That's exactly what I was going to say, Larry. So you took the words out of my mouth. So
sorry.
It's almost like we all did the same training.
Right.
But I think part of that story too, they also kind of went through the victim, and I see this a lot with farm families, as couples might not be getting along or whatever, but just the victim mentality, the villain mentality that you're always the problem or whatever, and just how helpless that people kind of give the perception that they are. So they're not very proactive, I guess, in taking care of responsibility sometimes for their own issues.
Yeah, that's one of the skills that we talked about is the rest of the story, right? And so with the victim mentality, it's sometimes helpful to think about what is my role in this conversation. With that villain mentality, when you think it's the other person's problem, it's really important to kind of assume that people aren't villains, right? And to assume that people generally, have other people's good interests at heart. And so you might ask yourself, why would a reasonable, rational, and decent person do this? And then finally asking yourself, and with that helpless mentality as well, like, oh, there's just nothing I can do about it. You might say, what should I do right now to move forward to what I really want, to kind of fill that, master your story and fill that pool of meaning.
It was interesting because, I relate it to discussions I've had with clients, and had a husband and wife, and the husband was, I want to pay my bills milking 70 cows. And when I started listening and hearing the wife, she was tired of getting up at 4:30 in the morning and having bills they couldn't pay. She really wanted an empty barn, but it's not what she would really say in the dynamic we were in.
Yeah, Fred, I think that goes back to one of the key things we talked about was start with the heart, right? And focus on
Yep.
what you really want, because if you don't talk it out, you will act it out. So if you have high emotion with it, you may act it out versus giving your thoughts. So really kind of focusing on what do you want for yourself or the other people, whether that's your spouse or in a relationship or organization that you're working with. And, being I guess, good about sharing your good intent. So what are your goals for this situation versus kind of going back negative with it?
Yeah, it's really important also to share your good intent as well. A lot of times, you can, share that, you have the partnership's best interests or the other person's best interests at heart as well. It's not just looking out for number one, but that you're trying to make this relationship better through this crucial conversation, right? And sharing that, with the other person and sharing your meaning and where you're coming from and with the other person helps them kind of feel safe in that conversation. The other thing that kind of goes along with adding, your meaning into the conversation is, Larry mentioned this earlier, but the backstory ask is what we, one of the skills that we learned, stating your past. So start with the facts, and then you give us the story that you're telling yourself based on those facts, and then you follow up with that person and say, is this what you're seeing as well? So you might say, I noticed this, or we agreed to this, and yet I'm not seeing that. I've noticed you behaving in a certain way or saying certain things, and then you follow that and you tell the person, this is the story that I've told myself based on your actions. I'm beginning to wonder if you feel a certain way or if you're having certain intentions. And then you end that by asking the other person, is this, help me understand. What's your view on this? Am I seeing this right? Help me fill in the blanks on the story that I'm telling.
I think those are like important kind of questions to ask into. And then when they start responding, I think it's important for us to, some of the other skills are just on the listening part of it, just to kind of figure out what their path is, where they're coming from. And so when they do say something, how do we try to kind of, just ask them back or try to mirror or paraphrase what they're saying. So like the simple questions like, what do you think about that? Or you say you're okay, but your tone of your voice or the look on your face or the rolling of your eyes or something that kind of tells me something completely different. But just, the paraphrasing and just ask them to kind of verify that this is what I'm hearing. Is that what you're really saying? And then try to, I think there was another skill they used on the ABC of how do you agree and build and compare. So try to agree on at least what you're talking about, try to build upon it. And just anytime somebody brings a crucial conversation to you, and you try to kind of compare that to what you thought they might have said compared to what you understood.
And if the person is feeling defensive based on some of the stuff that you're saying, you can make it safe by using a skill called contrasting, um, which I think, Larry, you said that you've learned about and practiced a little bit in some of your training as well, that idea of contrasting. So saying, I don't intend, or this is not what I'm trying to say. This is not what I'm trying to get across. I do want you to understand whatever it is. And not throwing a but in between. A but kind of makes people defensive sometimes too. You know, I don't mean this, but I do mean this, and just separate it out as two different contrasts. This is not what I'm trying to get across. Here is what I'm trying to get across.
And I think that's a good skill just to kind of prevent the conversation sometimes from getting emotionally charged in the first place, because once it gets charged, it's a little tough to diffuse it.
Mm-hmm.
Since the training, I'm listening better, I think. And that is difficult. Almost everything, I'm not trying to, but
Yeah.
it's hard not to include that but, and it negates whatever goes after that. So
It's almost like the old no offense, but you're on automatically be defensive as soon as somebody says no offense, but.
And obviously these conversations don't take 5 minutes, right? So there's definitely some longer conversations that you have when you get into some crucial conversations. But it's important to think about moving into action after you've had a good conversation and do some follow up. So again, another acronym we had was WWWF. So who, what, when, and follow up. So who's going to move to action? What are you going to do? Give yourself a timeline as far as when will you move to that action, and then schedule some follow up with that person as far as, going back and having that conversation again to see if you've progressed forward with, the issue at hand.
Yeah, how many times have you had a conversation and you feel like both of you came away like feeling better and stronger about your relationship and that you were moving forward about something only to have that conversation again a couple months later? And a lot of times that's because we don't include the action items at the end of a conversation.
And I think as we're having some of these conversations too, just the thought process of, are the people that we're working with, sometimes you're doing this in a group setting. Are there some people in that group setting that are getting very silent and kind of withdrawing? Are there other people where you can kind of see their ears are starting to turn red and they're starting to move towards a little volatility, or maybe I think one of the terms they used was verbal violence, which sounds a little strong, but just anytime again, the ears start standing up or turning red, or they start getting a little fidgety with their emotions, just to realize that you have a big spectrum there, and you got to be careful and just try to recognize those that are withdrawn or those that are getting a little disturbed by what you're saying.
So I think we kind of move through, really quickly the basis of crucial conversations. And obviously there's a whole lot more that you could dive into with this conversation. I would recommend to our audience, if they're interested more in learning more about these skills, to read the Crucial Conversations book, and then, seek out if there's a class in Crucial Conversations in your area or something similar that you could get involved with. I think the more you practice these skills, the better you become. I know for myself, it's important to write things down and kind of go through in my mind some of these skills before I start to practice them, and then start to implement them. And the more you use them, the better you're going to get at making these conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved this book so much that I'm working through it with my students this semester. So I think it's definitely something that you can read on your own or read with a partner, or people that you work with. There's a lot of really actionable stuff in the book, and that's one of the things that I enjoy about it is it gives steps, and it lays things out pretty straightforward. I didn't realize until we took the class that there's a follow-up book, so I already bought the follow-up book and started that one, and it's called Crucial Accountability, Tools for Resolving Violated Expectations, Broken Commitments, and Bad Behavior. So I'm excited to dive into that one too.
Yeah, I think for any dairy producers, farm families that are listening, I mean, just I think the sometimes in these crucial conversations, it's tough. It's sometimes necessary, I guess, to have a facilitator or a third party actually there. And so sometimes, I guess, in these farm families, it's kind of something we could actually try to help them with a little bit as we sit down at the kitchen table with them to kind of work through some of these, because they definitely impact the management of the farm and some of the production techniques and things like that. So I think it's just a skill we can bring to the table as well.
You know, as I was sitting there going through some data on milk pricing, it really reminded me that it's not about always the data. We're in a people business. And if we are building these relationships and having these critical conversations, we probably aren't as good at our job as we could be. And I'm, reminded we're in the people business.
That's what I love about Extension, and that's what I love about working with the people that we get to work with is we really lean on those relationship builder strengths, and we're in it if we wanted to do it for something besides the people, we could make a lot more money doing it somewhere else, but we chose to do it in Extension because we ultimately want to make sure that that farm families are successful and that the dairy industry is successful. So that is one of my favorite parts of working with the folks on this call, but also a lot of other people in Extension.
Well, Gail, I think that was a good way to wrap up this podcast. Appreciate everybody being on the call and kind of walking through what we learned on Crucial Conversations. And we want to thank our audience for joining us today. And we look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/EXT.